Well, hello. Today we're going to make a rod bag to put your rod in, and then the rod and the bag goes into the rod tube. Why? Well, you may remember this video if you did watch it. If you didn't, it's worth watching. The indestructible rod tube. Now, you saw me back over it, and the rod was okay. So, why build a rod bag? Well, first of all, there's no bag. That's what your rod's doing all the way down the road as you're going to your fishing spot. And you may be fishing one day like I was. You make a cast, and the rod tip flies off in the middle of a cast, not even fighting a fish. You say, it's the fault of the rod. No, it's your fault. If you own the rod more than 6 months, and it breaks while you're making a cast or fighting a fish or something like that, it's your fault. Either you hit it with something, or scraped it on something, or you stored it in a rod tube without a bag. This also is an indestructible rod tube. This is the one actually I ran over. You can see the road rash on it. But the difference is, and there is a rod in here, but it's in a rod bag. This rod and all of its sections are protected from the rod tube and from each other. There's no vibration as you're going down the road, and that's important. Normally, I just buy a factory-made rod bag just because they're inexpensive and it's just not worth my time. However, the rod that I just built is a weird size and configuration, so I couldn't find a ready-made rod bag for it. So I decided to make one. And in case you run into it, or just you're kind of crafty and want to make all your own stuff, just follow me along. We can make the rod bag together. Here we go. The first thing I did was to determine which rod section was the longest. This would be the section that I would measure for the overall length of the bag pockets. Now we need a width dimension for each pocket. To do this, I measured the widest part of the rod's butt section, which in this case was located at the largest guide. Measuring the rod blank and the guide height together, I recorded that dimension, which was 62 millimeters. Because the frame of the guide's eye is larger across than the blank, I recorded that dimension as well. This is measured at 25 millimeters. These two dimensions were added together to determine an overall 87 millimeter pocket width for the butt section. For the tip section, the process was the same. The widest part of the rod section was where the largest guide was located, which was 38 millimeters. The eye of the guide was 15 millimeters, so the pocket width for the tip section would be 53 millimeters. To lay out and mark the measurements on the bed sheet, I started by adding 200 millimeters to the length for a flap to fold over the opening. The existing seam of the bed sheet was included in this measurement because I wanted to retain it for the top of the bag. To this, I added the 1645 millimeter length of the butt section, which gave me an overall bag length of 1845 millimeters. But wait, I also needed to account for material that would be eaten up by the seam. So I also added 25 millimeters to make room for the seam. This is called a seam allowance in sewing circles. So the overall length at which the bed sheet was to be cut would be the rod length plus the flap length plus the seam allowance, which equaled 1,870 millimeters. I'll be cutting inside the existing seam of the bed sheet along the length of the pattern, so my width measurements will be from this cut mark. To determine the overall width at which the bed sheet would be cut, I added the pocket width measurements for each of the rod sections, which came out to 140 millimeters. And I also had to add that pesky 25 millimeter seam allowance, making it 165 millimeters. Because I'll be folding the cutout of the material in half to create both sides of the bag, I will need to double this dimension to 330 millimeters for the pattern's overall width. So, after all that, here's the cut lines for the material I needed for my rod bag. Once the pattern was cut out, the material was folded in half widthwise and ironed to keep the edges all in line. At this point, I reversed the fold so that the bag was inside out. I'll be sewing a variation of a French seam. Normally, you would sew the first seam with it folded the other way. However, I want the smooth side of the French seam to be on the inside and the flap on the outside. So I'm reversing the process to accomplish that orientation. I decided on a 7 millimeter or about a 1/4 inch allowance for the first seam. I then inserted a few pins along the length of the material to hold it in place as I sewed. With the machine set to a basic straight stitch, set at about 2.5 millimeters, I hemmed the entire length and bottom of the cut edges together to form my inside-out bag. The inside, which will become the outside, was then pulled out and the corners were coaxed into shape with the end of my ruler. Keeping the seam pushed out as far as I could, I ironed the seam flat to prepare it for the second sewing. Back on the sewing machine, which was still set up with the same basic stitch, I chose a 16 millimeter or about a 5/8 seam allowance. This would be more than adequate to conceal the edges of the first seam inside the bag. This will complete the reversed French seam. Doing it this way leaves a smooth edge inside the bag so the rod sections slide in easily without getting hung up. The seam also resists separation, which makes me think it's a Parisian French seam. An inside joke for my fellow Canadians. The next step was to create partitions, or pockets, that would keep the two rod sections protected from one another. This is done by simply measuring in from the finished stitching or from the opposite folded edge. I used the width measurements for each rod section calculated at the beginning of this process. After marking the butt section pocket width of 87 millimeters from the folded edge of the bag, I confirmed that the remaining distance to the seam opposite the fold was at or more than the 53 millimeter pocket width for the tip section. At this point, a line was drawn the length of the bag. A single seam will be sewn on this line to form the two pockets. I wanted a couple of tie ribbons on the bag, so I marked the position for each of those on this same line. Note that for the position of the top ribbon tie, I measured down 200 millimeters, which is the dimension I allowed for the top flap. From this point, I chose the position of the ribbon tie. For the position of the bottom ribbon tie, I just eyed it up and picked a spot on the line that looked good. Each ribbon tie was centered on the chalk line and pinned in that position for sewing. Using the same setup on the sewing machine, I sewed along the line for the full length of the bag, capturing each ribbon tie as I came to it. A quick overhand knot was put into each end of the ribbon ties to prevent fraying and then trimmed. The rod bag is complete.